So, in this third part of this series on studying learning on life, I'm going to talk about a workflow or a research process that is my own way of working when I'm trying to look at learning online, and it's something I've tended to refer to as computationally supported interactional ethnography. So it's a ethnography of interaction, looking at people's practices through their interactions, that's computationally supported, but is also situated and looks at learning as being something that takes place both online and offline, always if online activity is included. So the question is, how do you study the practices of learning in a platform or on a platform? And so there is more than one way to go. And I'm going to talk about my way of doing it, but there are, of course, many other ways of doing it. And it's worth saying that essentially have been an ethnographer, moving into platform research and internet research from that side rather than from the data science side. There's a lot of people working in this space that have moved from doing data science into looking at online practices. And I'm moving the other way, where I've started to do more data science work as a consequence of trying to do ethnography in computational environments like social media with online learning platforms and that kind of thing. So part of the way I work is to, and my way of integrating kind of the data science aspects of doing the kind of research I do with my ethnographic background is to follow something that Tricia Wang said in 2013, that big data needs thick data. And this is based on the ideas of one of the sort of major figures in ethnography, Clifford Geertz, who did the study of cockfighting in Bali, which you see in the background there, who talked about thick data, thick descriptions. And this goes all the way back to Gilbert Ryle in 1949, talking about the difference between description and thick description. And a thick description could be described as the cornerstone of ethnographic work, that you produce descriptions of practice and of activity and of situations that are thick, that are rich, that are more than superficial descriptions. They try to get at making meaning of something. And when we look at platforms or internet practices, this whole on-life space, we can say that platformization, it both reveals and obscures learning in new ways. And one of the ways learning is revealed is by accessing the massive quantities of big data that are readily available, that can be extracted through a platform. But that big data often makes very little sense without thick descriptions of the practices taking place that allow you to contextualize and situate what that data means. Big data, in a sense, are data points that are reductions. They are reductions of experiences, of interactions that people have. They may mean something, but they must be unpacked. And so we need thick descriptions in order to understand what those data points mean, and therefore understand what their combination and their processing and their analysis means. So the approach that I'm proposing here is the integration of large-scale analysis with situated thick descriptions that can help avoid the blind spots that come with big data, the deluge of data that becomes available once you start looking at practices on digital platforms. And that's because data patterns very often beg investigation of the accounts that people make about those patterns, or the descriptions that are available of or can be made of the practices. So connecting the big data the patterns found in the data to the descriptions of what's happening in situ enable a much more robust picture of what's going on. In this graph here, you can see yearly activity in a Facebook group where teachers were engaging in professional development. And there are 13,000 teachers interacting in this group, and you can see that in the sort of like average month, there's about 1,000 to 1,200 posts and comments in this group. So there's a lot of activity. But you can see the activity is different over different parts of the year. So if you can see here that the highest levels of activity are in February, March, and then in August, September, October, November, then dropping off in December. So we have low points in December and we have low points in June, July. And if I was just to look at that graph without having any understanding of the kind of group that produced it, the kind of group whose activity produced it, I might not make that much of it, but I know that this is a group of teachers discussing teaching practice. And not much teaching practice goes on in June or July because teachers are on holiday. Teachers also are on holiday at Christmas time. So they're not doing professional development and discussing with each other about their practices. They're on holiday. I can also see that there is a peak around February, March, as the term gets rolling again. And I also know that that's a period of time where teachers start to think about the year after and planning starts. And the same thing in August, September, October, that first term of the year where teachers are working with new groups of students and are planning their activity for the coming year. These are times where teachers reach out to other teachers to discuss their practices. So having an ethnographic engagement with that group means that I can interpret that graph in a way that goes far beyond the actual data points shown there. But at the same time, I would argue that in the case of studying activity on platforms or on the internet or on life, so to speak, that thick data needs big data. We can go out and just talk to people about the things they're doing. We can watch them doing the things they're doing, but that won't get us that robust a view of the patterns that might be found, because so many people in so many different situations may be involved in using an online platform, for instance, it's very difficult to get a kind of like a sense of what the variability in those practices look like. And now that's not necessarily something you have to do. You can stick with the level of the individuals. You can do biographical research, for instance. You can do research on a very particularly bounded group. But if you want to get an understanding of, say, learning practices in a large online forum on Reddit, for instance, then I would argue that you need to get involved in understanding the patterns of the activity there and not just the individual moments of activity. So in that sense, the accounts of activity that can be produced through interviewing and through observation and through other ethnographic methods beg investigation of the patterns taking place. So in this example from that Facebook group, you can see that over the 40-month lifespan of the group here, these graphs are showing the proportion of threads with URLs in a post and URLs in the comments. So that's when people post links to things. And that's not something I necessarily would have looked for, but I had a sense from the ethnographic engagement with the group and from interviews that there were different phases in the group's lifespan, that the group had changed over time. And so looking at those patterns, it became possible to see that there was a shift in the way that people shared resources. In the beginning, you can see the blue line on top is mostly the moderator posting, who also created the group, posting links. So the moderator, what I call pump priming, trying to get the group going, bringing resources into the group to make it valuable to other members. Then somewhere around month 7 or so, you see a shift into a more reciprocal phase where people are sharing resources with each other. Somebody posts something, or somebody asks a question about something, and then somebody else posts, here's something I found that's useful for you. So a kind of more reciprocal sharing where the proportion of links shared is relatively similar in posts and comments. Then when you get to month 30, you start to see another shift. And that's that the number of URLs in posts starts to climb dramatically, and that the number of links in comments starts to go down. And then we see that the sharing activity is not reciprocal anymore, and you see that the group goes into a kind of a phase of individual self-promotion where you get a certain group of users that are just constantly sharing stuff they've done with no discussion about it and no reciprocity in the sharing. And so the character of the discussion in the group changes a lot. And so that's a way that an intuition that comes from the ethnographic work can lead to looking for patterns, so that shifts in a lifespan of a group over 40 months can be understood, rather than just that there are different moments in the group. You can start to actually break down how those moments fit together. So if I go back to this slide, you'll see that there's a little bit of coding in a language called Python there. And this is code that allows you to do analysis on these large-scale patterns. And so a question that I often get is, does this mean that educational researchers need to learn to code? And with the caveat, if they want to understand platform activity or like social media or these kind of activities. And so the answer I always give is yes, probably a little bit. Not that you need to become an amazing programmer to do this kind of work, but there is a need to be able to interact with the application programming interfaces, the APIs, that make data accessible to you when you work with platforms. If you can do a little bit of coding so that you can easily sort data, produce graphs, that kind of thing, it's a lot easier. Doing everything in Excel is very difficult because Excel stops working well when you start working with large volumes of data. Excel will only work with 500,000 lines. And 500,000 sounds like a lot, but once you start looking at likes or clicks or posts in a massive forum, or number of views that students have had in a learning management system, for instance, you can easily get to 500,000 moments very quickly. If you wanted to look at an entire year in a classroom as they used a Google Classroom or some other learning management system, you would easily go above 500,000 moments. Getting above 500,000 is very easy if you can code in something like Python or R a little bit so that you can work with the data, but very difficult if you're using something like Excel. It's also the case that being able to engage with the data through code gives you an ability to understand how the database that you're looking at is structured, how the data that you're working with is structured in a way that you might not get working through simple GUI tools like Excel. So there is an advantage to getting your hands dirty with the code, but this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become an excellent coder. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't mean you need to become even a good coder. You can be a bad coder, but yes, probably if you want to do the kind of work that looks both at the patterns and the large scale activity going on these kind of platforms, and at the kind of more micro level of the interactions, or the meso level of the kind of like ethnographies of the context. If you want to combine these levels effectively, I would argue that you need to have some ability to code a little bit. But that said, I want to talk about the kind of key methodology that I have been using working with these kind of platforms. And that's something called trace ethnography. And this is an attempt to take an ethnographic attitude and an interpretive stance, ethnographic interpretive stance to working with data. And it's to viewing data as traces like footprints, traces that people leave. In this case, leave in the databases of platforms that I'm able, or we're able to extract through the APIs and then make sense of. So this is it's a tradition that has sort of evolved out of the documentary ethnography tradition, document ethnography tradition that you can often find in kind of information systems and library and information systems research. And basically, it's predicated on the idea that documentary traces are the primary mechanism in which users themselves know their distributed communities and act with them. So the traces that people leave on platforms like Facebook or a learning management system are the primary way that the system can make sense of their activity. They're the primary way that they make sense of each other's activity by posting to each other or liking something, or in any other way leaving a kind of trace on the platform. But they're also the primary way in which we as researchers have access to their activity. So we're all using the same traces and working with the same traces. And the way that I work with them is what I would call an integrated method, in the sense that it's very, very mixed. So I work with field ethnography and interviews, with virtual ethnography, with discourse analysis on the things, the traces that people leave, but also with computational content analysis for working with very large data sets, and social network analysis for mapping and graphing the relationships between different participants or between different topics within a set of interactions. And the direction that I move through these can be different depending on the study I'm doing, and they tend to move back and forth. So I don't tend to work in a traditional sequential mixed methods form where I do one kind of analysis, like I do a quantitative analysis and then do a qualitative analysis to understand more about the things I found in the quantitative one, or I start with a qualitative analysis and then try to look in the quantitative. I tend to move back and forth and do both at the same time, so that the field ethnographic work and the virtual ethnographic work informs the computational techniques I use, and the statistical work I do, and the statistical work and computational techniques, the data science part informs the ethnographic work in the field or virtually. So a kind of example of this is work I did on understanding learning in large-scale citizen science platforms. These are platforms where people do what can be described as click work, analysis work for scientists as part of scientific projects. In this case, people looking for and classifying galaxies. And one of the things about this in this case, this project Galaxy Zoo, is that they have 1.5 million, or had 1.5 million contributors to this project, and there's a huge forum attached to it. So a lot of people going in here, looking at pictures of galaxies and classifying them and analyzing them for the scientists, and then going onto the forum and talking about galaxies and asking for people's help to understand a picture they've seen and trying to learn something about galaxies. So in analyzing that forum, I had to try to find ways to reveal learning in those interactions. And so working with colleagues, one of the things we found was that in our virtual ethnography of that forum, we found that there was a lot of discussion of artifacts. And artifacts in this case, you can see in this picture here, there's a big bright thing on the right-hand side of that picture. And that's what would be considered to be an artifact. In this case, that's a star in the foreground of the image. So you can see in the middle of the image, there is actually a galaxy, but it's quite obscured by this light pattern created by this star in front of it in the image. And oftentimes light from stars and stuff bounces off the insides of the telescopes that are used for taking these pictures, and it creates all kinds of funny patterns. And they call these imaging artifacts. And so looking for the use of the word artifact in this forum, we found that there were different ways of using it. People ask questions about artifacts. They pose statements of fact. And so this kind of like doing a discourse analysis of these instances of the use of the word produced a representation of different ways that it's used. So explanation of the forum, statements of fact, and questions. And who's doing what? Is it a volunteer? Is it a volunteer moderator on the forum? Or is it one of the scientists, the astronomers attached to the project? And you can see in this that the scientists speak relatively infrequently about artifacts, but when they do, they explain what the phenomenon is. The volunteer moderators will tend to simply state that an image has an artifact in it most often, whereas the volunteers will ask questions. So that's kind of how you would expect it to be. But the question became like, where should we look in this massive volume of data? So one of the things to do was to plot over time the use of this term, like when does the topic of artifacts come up with? And by doing that, you can start to see that artifacts became much more intense towards the end of the data set we had, and that there were particular moments, in this case, 3 particular moments, where the amount of topicalization stood out. So these are good hotspots to look at. Very much this often comes down to trying to use the ethnographic work to get some kind of intuition about what to look for in the data, looking in the data, and then finding those critical instances in the data that you can look at more manually. So this revealed these moments to look at. And in these moments, we found these discussions where, you know, for instance, a volunteer would ask, I see something in the picture. What is it? Have I found something new? Very often, the volunteers would think they've found a new phenomenon in space. And the volunteer moderators would say, this is what it is. It's a foreground star from our galaxy. The colors and spikes and blue center are all optical artifacts. And then maybe a scientist would come in and say, yeah, the main goal is to classify the galaxy at the center of the image and mostly to ignore the optical artifacts. So what you find is that volunteers would have very long and detailed discussions of the way artifacts are produced, the construction of the different telescopes used, and an enormous amount of knowledge coming forward about the actual imaging process that led to these pictures of galaxies, where the scientists, which had a conflict with the goals of the scientists who just wanted classifications of their pictures. They had hundreds of thousands of pictures that needed classifying, and volunteers spending their time talking about the way telescopes are made wasn't helping them get their goals done. So we found an interesting goal conflict between the activity of volunteers and the needs of the project here. And that's something you can do by following the analytic process between the kind of aggregated level of the data and the individual interactions in different directions and moving back and forth. The other thing that I think is particularly important is partly because we're using so much mobile technology now that all online activity takes place offline as well. There is no online activity that isn't situated in the world in some way. And that is really Luciano Faridi's point with the whole idea of on life, that we're on all the time, but that our on is also situated in an offline context. And so that's one of the things I've looked at. And this is a project where we've been looking at the way that people take pictures in and post to Instagram in museums. And so one of the things to do is to look at their online activity. So in this case, we can see a series of 16 pictures that a visitor has taken in a museum and posted online. And looking at their online activity tells us something. It tells us that that they've created a collection, that they've made deliberate decisions to post stuff that goes together. They've applied filters, all of this accessible through the API, what filters and frames they've put on their pictures, also how they've named their pictures gives us clues as to their activity. So all of this tells us that this particular visitor has gone to a museum and produced a collection of pictures that fit together, both in the way that they're filtered and the way that they're framed and the captioning of them. And also you can see something in the choice of subject matter, the motifs in the images, that this is a cohesive collection. And what we can do is we can plot the location of those pictures from the time period during which they're taken. So these little triangular shapes represent Instagram taking positions during the time period that that collection was taken. So we can see that somehow there is a connection between this online story being posted, this collection of images, and an experience in the physical space. But to break that down, then we can start looking at the relationship between those particular pictures taken and the sequence in which they're taken. And what we found was that it wasn't really a straight line of pictures taken. What the visitor has done in order to produce this story, because in Instagram you can't, or at least at the time we did this study, it posted sequentially, so you couldn't go back and edit your stream of pictures. You had to post things in the order you wanted them to appear. So what the visitor has done is to go around the museum and move around the museum and change their route based on the way they want to produce a story online. So that online story has shifted the way they visit the museum. So simply looking at the online activity doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story here, because what it tells us is that the person has gone around a museum and they've framed stuff and they've filtered stuff so it looks similar, but connecting it to their activity in the physical space, to situating that online activity, tells us that they put a lot of effort into choosing and going back and forth within the museum in order to find a path through the museum that allowed them to post the right things in order to create that story online. And one of the ways that we have tended in the studies I've been involved to kind of gain access to some of that connection is in using a technique that Dubois and Ford described in 2015 called trace interviews. And the idea here is that you show people the traces they make, either in the sense of with these Instagram images, directly showing them the Instagrams they've taken and asking them to talk about the traces they've left on this online platform, or in more complex data situations, producing visualizations that you can then show people about the patterns of their activity over time, for instance. So in the case of that Facebook study I was talking about earlier, where we talked about the moderator's practice, you can visualize that practice of the moderator posting resources and the resources in posts and comments over time, show that to the moderator or show it to other users and get them to explain what's going on at different moments in time, kind of like a technique called stimulated recall that's often used, for instance, when looking at art appreciation, like showing people a piece of art and getting them to discuss it, or showing people video of them doing something and getting them to discuss what they were doing. It's very similar, but doing it with the traces that people leave on platforms. And so it does a couple of things. It enhances recall because it gets people talking about something specific. They become responsible for producing accounts about specific instances within that data. It can help you validate your interpretations of the trace data or produce new interpretations of the trace data. And it addresses data joining problems, which I'll talk about in a second. And it can help respond to ethical problems relating to the use of personal data without consent. So it can show users the kind of, or show participants the kind of data you're collecting on them, make it real for them through visualizations, and then get them to respond to how they feel about it being used before you go ahead and publish things. So there's a couple of really good functions for trace interviews in this kind of a process. One of them that's sort of particularly interesting here is this addressing the problem of data joining. And I want to give a quick example here of something from that Instagram study, which is very much in line with what Miller and Madanu describe as polymedia, the idea that people are on multiple platforms at any given time. So in this case, we were studying Instagram use, so we were looking entirely at Instagram use. And had we not done trace interviews, we would not know anything about the way that the people we were following used other platforms. And in this case, this example here, we have a user that is on Instagram, but also on Twitter. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When you use a mobile phone, all of those platforms and little apps that are on there form a kind of ecosystem. They're not divided up. They're only divided up to us as researchers because we've decided we're doing an Instagram study. And in this case, we've got a user that goes to the museum and starts posting pictures of sort of gross things, right? Snakes. So she posts a picture of a snake that says the snake is dead and behind a glass panel, panicked anyway, doing sort of little jokey captions. Then posts a second Instagram saying it's like I've always said, you should look out for animals with more or less than 4 legs, and hashtag tiger python, hashtag snake. This is going on Instagram. Directly after that second Instagram, someone posts to Twitter, either Johan Susanna stops with the Instagramming of nasty stuff, or I will have to unfollow, just saying. And in response to that tweet, the person in the museum Instagrams cute animal just for at Mia Pia, who's the person that tweeted to them. And then says, you will be and then posts on Twitter, you will be spammed with cute animals soon. And so the Mia Pia person on Twitter says adrenaline shaky. And then the original person, Johan Susanna, continues going around the museum posting pictures of cute animals for this person who's responding to them on Twitter, and using the @ tag to speak to them directly in each case. And we would have completely missed that if we hadn't done the trace interview, which revealed that there was an interaction taking place on another platform. Because what we see is a user or a participant that goes to a museum is creating collections of pictures on Instagram based on one particular kind of topic, which is basically creepy, gross stuff, and then suddenly switches to doing pictures of cute things instead. So changes their orientation in visiting the museum and producing a story of their visit to the museum. And that orientation change is because of an interaction on a platform that we weren't even looking at. So it can be quite important to both look at the data traces on the platform of interest that you're looking at, whether it's a school platform or a social media platform or whatever it is. Also to try to understand the situated context in which that activity is taking place, and to try to get a sense of how other things, other platforms that might not be visible are affecting what you're studying. So in the case of looking at school platforms, it's very common that students are using other ways of communicating. They're using WhatsApp or whatever on the side in order to coordinate their activity that's actually taking place on the school's platform, the school's learning management system. So what you see in the learning management system is not the whole story about the coordination of activity taking place in order to perform a particular task. It's only the part that the students want to reveal within that school context. Or maybe the school platform doesn't even work very well, so they don't really like using it, so they don't post on it particularly often. They just post what they're required to do, when a whole bunch of the other work and the conversations and the real learning is taking place on another platform that's not visible to you as a researcher, unless you talk to them about it and find a way to get access to it by working with the participants. So these kind of like looking at both the big data patterns, finding the situated context for the postings, and trying to understand the broader digital context of what's going on is really important to trying to get that, to maintain that ethnographic, that kind of ethnographic view of the practices that are taking place. So all of this requires quite a range of different approaches and kind of methodological competencies. And I would argue a kind of transdisciplinarity. And the way that I've sort of described it is that educational researchers need to adapt if they want to understand these kind of platform and on-life activities. That coding can be a natural part of an interpretive research process, that coding and working with data doesn't have to be difficult, and it doesn't have to render the work you're doing as something other than an ethnographic practice, that it can be part of an ethnographic practice. And that transdisciplinarity requires some shared language and understanding of each other's approaches. That's something we know from transdisciplinary research work, but it's clear that if you're going to start combining different kind of research traditions to a certain extent, even if you're going to maintain an ethnographic frame to do it, you need to understand enough about the language and approaches of, for instance, data science in order to be able to communicate with people doing data science, in order to make the work that you're doing with it, even if it's from an ethnographic point of view, reasonable. And from my perspective, my own work combines kind of learning sciences, the classical methods from learning sciences like interactional ethnography and video studies, and newer ones like learning analytics, with human-computer interaction. So looking at user studies, design research, AI studies, information systems research, and with newer fields like platform studies, which include areas like science and technology studies and computational social sciences and critical data studies, to kind of produce a kind of critical perspective as well, to answer questions about what the power is involved in these platforms, what the effect of these platforms are, who creates these platforms. So for me, I need to take both an interactional perspective, a technological perspective, and a critical perspective in different kind of proportions in order to understand the things I want to understand about how learning takes place and what the conditions for learning are with these kind of platforms when people are learning in these on-life settings.